Thank you very much, Jonathan. My lecture is only an hour and a half, so I'll quickly, succinctly say it in 15 minutes. But it's not for me to say that people have said I'm not bad as a lecturer. And the reason is, and I'll tell you the secret, how can you become a good lecturer in your field? You become a good lecturer in your field by leaving your audience frightened, maybe even biting their nails. That's even better. And yes, Professor Melnick said that even those who have made even more of a career by creating this intimidation and fear. But in order to retain my reputation as a lecturer, I'm going to keep you frightened, but perhaps I'll destroy it at the end by calming you down simultaneously. So stay with me for 15 minutes, please. In this talk today, which direction do I need to direct it in? Over here. Can you see it? Because I can't. It says Boaz Ganor. In my talk today, I would like to not only talk about generic issues and questions, but also the implications of those generic issues vis-à-vis terror on the security problems and terror issues in the State of Israel. The classic war was a symmetrical war wherein the war was run between two different countries, wherein an army was fighting another army, and the battlefield was a military battlefield. When I say symmetrical, don't misunderstand me. It's not as if they had the same military capabilities. But from the point of view of the entity, it was a state against a state. But in the 20th century, an additional dimension has been created, and that is one of the asymmetrical war, which didn't actually swap it, but was rather added to it. So when I say asymmetrical or symmetrical war, those are the literature one reads about those terminology. In other words, we're talking about asymmetrical war being a war between a state and a rogue gang or terrorist organization. So when I say asymmetrical, I can't bear the term, by the way, but I haven't got a better one to use. So why do I think that asymmetrical war is a problematic term? Because it immediately connects us to connotations that actually mislead us. Because when I say asymmetrical war, you immediately in the audience think that I'm talking about the model of the asymmetric war in the history of mankind. And that is David and Goliath, for example. Or you've got Goliath, for example, the great Philistine who is 2.5 meters tall, wearing armor, sort of state-of-the-art armor. And who is he fighting against? A little David who has a tiny little sling in his hand. That is the image immediately that sort of it creates in our imagination. This little shepherd, which is the terror organization. But unfortunately, that is the real picture, and Dan even mentioned that. Take the state, the weakest one in the world, and look at the strongest terror organization in the world today, which is ISIS. And still, the weakest country still has bigger resources, bigger capabilities and power. But per se, in action, it doesn't actually happen because they cannot cope and struggle and fight and contend with that. Because Goliath, when you're talking about a liberal democratic country, it is in shackles. Why? Because of its values, its liberal democratic values. Even before you do anything and anything is imposed from the outside, its internal morals and ethics and legislation, and in addition, the international humanitarian law, Geneva Convention, etc., etc., and so many other shackles upon shackles. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not criticizing it. That's the way it should be. But you need to call a spade a spade. After all, this Goliath is shackled and he has chains around his feet, and still he's supposed to fight that same David who does identify those same values. He doesn't actually recognize them, doesn't accept them, but he's going to fight Goliath. Now, the second dimension of this modern war is the psychological dimension, the media one, the one of world opinion, wherein you win not by paralyzing the firepower of your foe, but first and foremost, you actually paralyze their motivation to fight. Now, by the way, the terror organization is trying to actually paralyze their motivation of the state and vice versa. In other words, when I say when you are trying to actually paralyzing the motivation to fight, that is the nuclear infrastructure of the whole element of deterrence. Because when you talk about deterrence, you say that the actual foe still has the capability, but you want to actually make him lose his motivation. So that is the second actual dimension of asymmetrical war. Over the last few years, we've seen the arousal and the emergence of a third dimension, and that is the legal one. Not only are they trying to defeat and paralyze people in the battlefield, not only to acquire and captivate hearts and detrimentally affect the actual motivation to continue the war, but they're also trying to defeat the capability of the foe by delegitimizing him. In other words, it's a legitimization battlefield, and this is what we call the legal, or the one that actually takes place in the international tribunals and courts in The Hague and in other places. The greatest challenge of all of the modern war that Israel has to face, in other countries as well, you find them suddenly finding themselves in this problematic zero, is that you've got to win on all three battlefields simultaneously. You cannot allow yourself only to have the upper hand on the battlefield or on the legal terms or on the other one. You have got to win all three. You can't just actually been awarded the person who has never violated any human rights. No, it is incumbent upon you to find the right balance between all three. The actual entire sort of battle that we're now facing in Israel is something that we were not familiar with. Minister Gallant said the enemies of Israel understood that they can't defeat us in the battlefield, so they moved from the conventional war to the terror war. Well, I'd like to say that in an additional phase further. The enemies of the state of Israel understood that even in terror they won't manage to defeat us. And so now they're moving into BDS and delegitimization. In other words, they're taking the two other multi-dimensional warfare that we were speaking about, and that was grappling with the legitimization and the motivation and everything else, and thus imposing their victory on the state of Israel. Now, how is it manifest in the field? Let us look actually at the southern arena, at Hamas' protective edge, the mission that actually took place, the campaign in the Gaza Strip just last year. We're talking about 10,000 missiles and rockets that were actually barraged against two-thirds of the state of Israel. Where were they shot from? This is the diversion of actually being immersed in a civilian population. And here you can see the shooting points from the north of the Gaza, Israel, from where they were shot out to the most densely populated Israel, and the same. We're talking about the most densely populated area of the Gaza Strip. Look where they were shot from. They were barraged from there, from the most densely populated civilian population of the Gaza Strip. And we're talking about civilian buildings, knowing that if Israel does manage to actually hit the launch pad or at one of our warfare caches, then it's obvious then the Israeli will manage to either hit them directly or those civilian civilian structures, or because of collateral damage, because of what we actually, the direct hits. And this was unprecedented in modern history of battle. I mean, have you look actually on the right-hand side of the picture, you can see those tens of thousands of brochures that Israel sent from the air before they took any military steps, with explanations in Arabic that within a certain period of time there's going to be an action, a military step taken, a military attack. Please vacate, please evacuate immediately. They're telling them exactly. You can see the little red line there. In other words, they're even showing, the Israelis even pointed out to the Arab civilian population exactly their exit route, a safe exit route, and they committed to not hitting. So of course, what did the terrorists do? They shot from that specific civilian area. So, and what did they say to the actual civilians? Believe me, if you leave, if you do take that exit route that the Israelis have pointed out for you, we will have our revenge on you later on. And then don't forget the whole underground tunnel dimension that is also a different issue. Now, under the tunnels, where were they? Under those condominiums. That's where the headquarters are. That's where the terrorists were, under the hospitals. So if you want to actually have any damage against them, best way to do it, aerial attack against them, I will massively attack your civilians. That's basically what they're telling you to do. So everything that I have described here, Hamas learned from one mastermind, and his name is Hezbollah and Iran. So this whole topic of the psychological dimension was also, they were first-class pupils. They prepared surprises, quote unquote, for the state of Israel. And that term was brought by Nasrallah from the Hezbollah. And these were sort of embedded in various text messages that were sent to Israeli civilians, warning them not to go into this and not to do that. Messages were telling you that if you thought that the Iron Dome is really actually working as it ought to, well, that's a conspiracy against you. Ceasefire breakdowns, calls upon mothers, please do not allow your children to go into the Gaza Strip as soldiers, because otherwise they're going to be sent back to you as fatalities in sacks. And also other messages, and all of these little messages were sent out to Israeli citizens by the Hezbollah, by the Hamas. And it was the first time they actually declared that they're going to shoot last summer, 2014, against Tel Aviv. But just before they do it, what does Israeli media do? They start doing a countdown. They open up a direct broadcast. You can see one of our best commentators on Arab affairs who actually analyzes what? They analyze real-time the Hamas television. And what does the Hamas television do? Showing the Israeli commentator analyzing the Hamas. And you can see this kind of psychological warfare of the best. So I'm going to skip the paradox of the legitimacy and the deterrence, but I'll talk about that in the actual workshop when we talk about deterrence. And instead of that, I'm going to skip to the threat from the north. What I described here, which is a very, very difficult threat for a liberal democratic state, but that is nothing as compared to the next threat. And that is a threat that emanates from that actual, the Shiite crescent that we're talking about through Syria, and that perhaps starts with the Hezbollah in Lebanon, or perhaps ends in Lebanon. If we talk about 10,000 rockets and missiles that were owned by Hamas, we're now talking about 100,000 that Hezbollah has now holding on to as we speak, that can cover the entire territory of the state of Israel. So if you can see them waiting there in the bunkers, just waiting for us to take one step. So their strategy of the Hezbollah is a strategy that was designated to shoot 1,000 rockets per day. If in protective edge there were about 100 rockets shot every single day, and the Iron Dome succeeded in actually grappling with that situation. Now we're talking about the Iron Domes will be totally paralyzed if they start with 100,000 and starting 10,000 a day. So now I'll show you a very short 4-minute film which shows the Hezbollah concept about what they think the next campaign will look like.
وتقديرات إسرائيلية. تجمع التقارير والدراسات على أن حزب الله يدرب 5,000 مقاتل للسيطرة على مدن الجليل الأعلى ومستوطناته. قاتلين إلى 5 فرق هدفها الاستيلاء على 5 قطاعات من الجليل الأعلى. يتولى حزب الله إمطار منطقة الشمال بمئات الصواريخ دفعة واحدة، ما يمثل ضربة أولى قوية لمستوطني الشمال. وتتقدم بعدها الفرق على النحو الآتي: الفرقة الأولى تخترق نقطة الناقورة باتجاه الحدود وتجتازها نحو مستعمرة رش على طول 7 كيلومترات للاستيلاء على مدينة نهارية التي تقع على البحر الأبيض المتوسط ويسكنها 55,000 إسرائيلي، حيث يرجح أن تجري السيطرة عليها بالنار في المرحلة الأولى، ما يجعل من ساكنيها رهائن يصح استخدامهم دروعا بشرية. تتقدم فرقة باتجاه بلدة شلوم الواقعة على بعد 300 متر شرق الناقورة، حيث يسكنها نحو 6,500 إسرائيلي. تسيطر هذه الفرقة على البلدة وضواحيها، ما يمنح حزب الله أفضلية السيطرة على عقدة طرق رئيسية مؤدية إلى عدة مدن، وهذه الطرق هي الطريق 89، الطريق 899، وكما نلاحظ من خلال الخريطة فإن هذه الطرق الرئيسية.
I apologize, by the way, it's in Arabic and I can't see the Hebrew subtitles here in our booth. We're behind the stage. I apologize.
في الوقت عينه ترجح الدراسات أن تتقدم مجموعات صغيرة مدربة تدريبا جيدا بحرا إلى السواحل الإسرائيلية.
I won't show you the entire program because we haven't got sufficient time for that, but I would like to conclude with what I promised, and that's after I frightened you, I'm now going to calm you down a little bit. All that arsenal that I showed you, and there are not many countries that have such an arsenal that, like, similar to what the Hezbollah has in their hands. But this is not really to be used, in my opinion. It's in order to deter the state of Israel from taking steps not only against Hezbollah, but against Iran and its nuclear facilities. And therefore, we believe that Hezbollah will actually make a historical mistake if they do use that arsenal, and that one must remember. But in addition to that, the Hezbollah at the moment is really in the doldrums. It's really in a very, very sort of, unfortunately, in a condition, fortunately, that they cannot now become a realistic threat against us because they are at such a low place at the moment. So therefore, they're not daring do it at the moment. Hamas, for example, is also at the lowest possible place and position from the point of view of its organization. It's lost all its support from the Saudi Arabia Muslim Brotherhood, Syria's Assad's regime. After all, they were actually expelled from Syria. They were actually defined as a terror organization. The siege over Hamas is unprecedented, not from Israel, but from Egypt. We're talking about an economic crisis. What's happening? We're talking about the bottom. They're really they're the lowest position that they have ever been before. Now, for example, Syria no longer considered an enemy as Israel actually sees it. They've only got leftover of its military arsenal. So I think that this is the first time that the identity of Israel's interests and our moderate Sunni states around us is greater. And I said that at the Pentagon recently. It's perhaps the first time that we have such identical interests, which is even higher than there are sort of interests that we share with the United States. For example, the fear of the Shiite hegemony or the Iranian nuclear facilities. All those are shared interests. It's not definite that we even share those with the American administration. So the existential threat against the state of Israel till this very day has been singular. But in the future, there may be additional ones if Iran actually achieves its nuclear capabilities. But at the moment, there's only one existential threat. And perhaps I'm cutting off the branch I'm sitting on if I say it. And it's not terror. It is the Yom Kippur War. It is an organization of all the Arab wars in surprise, coordinated against it, and the conquering of the state of Israel. That threat at the moment is not actually on the horizon because there aren't such armies that exist anymore that can unite. Not Syria, not Libya, not Iraq. Egypt is a friendly country. Jordan is a friendly state. Saudi Arabia is more friendly than it is a foe. So that, for the moment, that threat does not exist. And therefore, I agree with the previous speakers that alongside the horrendous risks and threats that do exist, I mean, tectonic changes could actually take place. But this also creates opportunities, and you have to identify these opportunities, and then you have to take the courage to use those opportunities. Thank you.
We're going to break.